He had ordered men buried for less than a raised voice. But when his wife flinched away from his hand on their wedding night, Dante Ferraro stopped breathing. His fingers hung in the air inches from her shoulder and did not move. 6 days ago, she had been a waitress. Tonight, she wore his name, his ring, and the terror of a woman who believed she had been purchased. He lowered his hand. And then the most feared man in Providence asked her something he had never asked anyone. If you want to know what 4 words can do to 2 people, stay with me to the very end and subscribe now so you don't lose the story halfway. Drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Ivy Calloway had spent 3 years learning how to make herself unremarkable, and she had gotten so good at it that the 2 men who walked into the Rialto at 1:10 in the morning didn't look at her once. That was how she knew they had come for her. Real customers looked. Drunk ones looked too long. Men who had already decided what you were kept their eyes on the room and let you come to them. So Ivy went on drying glasses at the service while counting them the way she counted everything, and she waited for one of them to say her brother's name. It took 4 minutes. The taller one asked for whiskey. He had no intention of drinking, and when she set it down, he said mildly, like a man commenting on the weather, that he'd heard Danny Calloway was doing better. Some feeling in the left hand now. Good news. Ivy's stomach dropped straight through the floor of her body. Her face did nothing at all. She said she didn't know anyone by that name. The shorter one laughed, not cruelly, which was worse. He said that was smart. He said a lot of people in this city would have started explaining was how you told a stranger exactly which lie you were prepared to defend. And he said his associate would like to make her an offer and that she should hear it before she decided how she felt about it. Then he told her the number. 40,000, cash tonight for 1 notebook. Ivy set the glass down carefully because her hands had begun to shake and she refused to let them do it where anyone could see. $40,000. She made $19 an hour plus what people left on the bar. $40,000 was Danny's rehab for 11 months. It was the collections agency off her phone. It was sleeping. It was also, she understood with perfect clarity, the price of 9 men. She told them she didn't own a notebook. She told them she was a waitress, that she'd never been anything else, and that if they wanted to talk about paperwork, they should try the office. She said it flatly without heat, the way she'd learned to say things to men who were measuring her. The tall one studied her for a long moment. Then he left cash on the bar for a drink he hadn't touched, and the 2 of them walked out into the street. Ivy stood exactly where she was until the door stopped moving. Then she went into the walk-in cooler, closed the door behind her, and let her legs give out. She had known this was coming for 14 months. Knowing had not prepared her for how ordinary it would sound. The Rialto was a legitimate business. Everyone in Providence understood what legitimate meant when it stood next to the name Ferraro. It meant the books were clean, and the money that made them clean had come from somewhere that wasn't. Ivy had taken the job because it paid better than anywhere else on the harbor, and because nobody at the Rialto asked what you did with your afternoons. What Ivy did with her afternoons was keep a record for men who did not exist. It had started small. It had started because her brother asked her to. Danny had been rigging scaffold on the harbor project since he was 19, and half the crews he worked with were paid out of envelopes, men from Guatemala and Cape Verde and Afghanistan and West Warwick men, with no contracts, no pay stubs, no names on any manifest. The foreman liked it that way. The contractors loved it. And the men themselves took it because an envelope on Friday was better than nothing on Friday. But an envelope has no memory. So when a foreman shorted a man 40 hours or docked him for equipment he never touched or simply forgot a week, there was nothing to point at, nothing to argue with. You couldn't dispute a payroll you were never on. So Danny had asked his little sister, who was 17 and good with numbers and had nothing else to do with her evenings, to write it down. She had written it down for 3 years. Hours, advances, deductions, remittances, sent home, the whole grinding arithmetic of men the state of Rhode Island did not believe in. She wrote it in ballpoint, in spiral notebooks, in handwriting that got smaller every year because the notebooks filled up faster than she could buy new ones. The crews called her La Contadora, and then just the girl who counts, and once a month somebody would slide her $20 she hadn't asked for and refused to take it back. She had thought she was doing bookkeeping. She found out 14 months ago that she had been doing something else entirely. She got home at 3:15 and smelled it from the street. It wasn't a big fire. That was the first thing the fire marshal said, and he said it kindly like it was supposed to be comforting. The building was fine. The units on either side were fine. Ivy's kitchen was fine. Her living room had smoke damage and would need painting. Her bedroom was gone. Not the whole bedroom. The closet was intact. The bed frame was intact. What had burned with the specific patient thoroughness of something that had been helped along was the bottom drawer of her dresser and everything in it. The marshal asked if she kept anything flammable in there. Ivy heard herself say no. She heard herself say she had no idea. She heard herself thank him for coming out so fast and give him her phone number and stand on the sidewalk in her work clothes at 4 in the morning with the smell of her own life in her hair, and the entire time one thought went around and around in her skull like a coin in a drain. They hadn't waited for an answer. They had offered her $40,000 at 10 past 1, and by 2:30 they had already decided they didn't need her to say yes. The offer hadn't been an offer. It had been a courtesy, a chance for her to hand it over and stay alive, extended by men who had already lit the match. And they had burned the wrong drawer. Ivy had moved the notebooks 11 months ago. She had moved them the week the insurance letter came, the week she understood that she was not holding a ledger. She was holding the only proof that certain human beings had ever drawn breath. She had moved them somewhere no one would look, and she had never told a living soul, not even Danny. She stood on that sidewalk, and she did not cry. She was too busy doing math. They had come for her at work and at home in the same night. That meant they knew her schedule. That meant somebody at the Rialto had told them, or somebody watching the Rialto had. That meant tomorrow they would try something that didn't involve asking. And Danny was in a rehabilitation facility on Chalkstone Avenue, in a bed with a call button he could reach with one hand. She was there when the doors opened at 7. Danny Calloway was 26 years old and had been a scaffolder since before he could legally drink, and now he was learning to move 3 fingers on command. He looked at his sister's face for about 4 seconds before he told her to sit down and tell him what happened. She told him. All of it. The bar, the number, the fire. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the thing she had been avoiding saying to herself for 14 months. They're not scared of what you know, Ivy. They're scared of what you can prove. That was the difference. That was the whole difference. And it had taken her more than a year to understand it. 14 months ago, a personnel lift on the Harborline site had failed at the 4th floor tie-in, and the platform had come down. The official record said 3 injured, no fatalities, all employees under contract with a licensed subcontractor. The official record said the incident was investigated and the site cleared to resume work in 9 days. The official record said Danny Calloway sustained a spinal fracture in a workplace accident, which was true, and that his employer's carrier would evaluate the claim, which was also true right up until the letter came. Because there were 9 men on that platform, not 3. 6 of them were paid in cash. 2 of them died. Emiliano Duarte, who was 41 and had a daughter in Pawtucket and sent money to his mother in Quetzaltenango on the 4th of every month. Bashir Nazari, who was 29, who had been in the country 8 months, who had bought a phone card on the way to the site that morning because he called his brother every Tuesday. Neither of them appeared on any manifest, any payroll, any tax filing, any safety log, any contractor roster, any inspection sheet. Legally, neither of them had been on that platform. Legally, neither of them had been on that site. Legally, they had not died. They had stopped being anywhere. And their families had been handed a word that meant nothing and cost nobody anything. Missing. Marisol Duarte had not been told she was a widow. She had been told her husband had left. And Danny's claim had come back denied in 17 days on a single sheet of letterhead with one sentence that Ivy had read so many times she could see it with her eyes closed. Claimant does not appear on the payroll register for the date of loss. He had been on that platform. He had come off it in pieces. And the paper said he had never been there at all. Ivy had gone home that night and taken out her spiral notebooks and understood finally what she was holding. 9 names, 9 sets of hours, 9 men time-stamped and cross-referenced across 3 years in ballpoint, in her handwriting, going back further than any of them could have faked and forward past the morning the lift came down. She wasn't a bookkeeper. She was the only witness who had written anything down. Danny made her promise 2 things before she left. He made her promise not to go home, and he made her promise not to go to the police because the last man who had gone to the police about Harborline was a site safety coordinator named Vaughn who had lost his certification, his marriage and his lease inside 5 months, and now drove for a delivery app in Fall River. Ivy promised. She broke the second promise before noon, which is how she learned exactly how deep the water was. The detective was polite. He took her statement. He asked twice whether she had documentation, and when she said it was in a safe place, he asked very gently whether she'd be willing to bring it in. She said she'd think about it. She was on the sidewalk outside the station for less than 90 seconds before her phone buzzed with a number she didn't know, and a voice she'd never heard told her that a nice girl like her shouldn't be making friends downtown. Ivy looked up at the building she had just walked out of. That was the moment she stopped believing she could survive this by being careful. Nobody in Providence knew what Dante Ferraro had done that same week because Dante Ferraro had spent 2 years making certain that nobody knew anything about him that he hadn't decided to release. I was 38. He had inherited an organization from a father who died still convinced that his son was too clean to hold it, and he had spent every month since proving the old man half right. He was pulling the Ferraro name out of everything that could be traced and pushing it into everything that could be audited: construction, freight, hospitality, and above all, the 11-figure carcass of the old harbor, which the Castellane Group was resurrecting into $900 million of marina casino floor and luxury frontage under the name Harborline. Ferraro money was in Harborline, a great deal of it. It was the single largest legitimate position his family had ever taken, and it was going to be the thing that let his children, if he ever had any, inherit a company instead of a war. Two problems were eating him alive. The first was his own family. The council wanted the Brannick alliance out of Boston, wanted it sealed to the traditional way, wanted Dante married to a woman he had met twice and disliked both times, and every time he refused, the refusal cost him. He had refused 3 times. The third refusal had been met with silence. And silence from that room meant they had stopped asking him and started arranging around him. A marriage inside the life meant a partner inside his house, inside his accounts, inside his decisions. He would have traded a limb first. The second problem was arithmetic. His own audit, his own run by people he'd hired from outside, which had scandalized his uncle, showed money leaving Harborline through contractors Dante had never approved. Not a lot at any one time. That was what made it good. It came out in scattered increments across 7 vendors. None of them large enough to alarm anyone. All of them buried in a project so vast that $800,000 looked like a rounding error. He had been staring at those 7 names for 3 weeks when a man he trusted told him that somebody was hunting a waitress at the Rialto for a notebook. Dante asked what was in the notebook. The answer took 11 hours to assemble, and when it came back, it did something to him that very little had done in 2 years. Because 2 of the 7 shell contractors bleeding his money were the same 2 shells that had been paying cash wages on the harbor site. The theft and the erasure weren't 2 crimes. They were one machine. You could not steal that much from a $900 million project without a category of expenditure that nobody was allowed to audit. And the only expenditure nobody audits is the one paid to people who are not permitted to exist. Somebody was making men invisible so the money could be too. And a 22-year-old girl who carried plates for a living had been writing all of it down in ballpoint for 3 years. Yes, sir. He found her at 9 at night, 4 blocks from the Rialto, walking to a shift she should not have been walking to. Ivy saw the car and did not run because there was nowhere to run to. She had $11, no apartment, a brother who couldn't walk, and the certainty that whichever direction she picked someone was already standing in it. She had decided that morning that if it was going to happen, it might as well happen upright. So when the rear door opened, she got in. She recognized him. Everyone recognized him. It was the strangest thing about the whole night that she had spent a year being terrified of shadows, and now she was sitting next to a face she had seen in a newspaper. He did not introduce himself. He did not threaten her. He told her evenly that her apartment fire had been set with a chemical accelerant, that the man who set it worked for a crew out of Cranston, and that the crew out of Cranston had been paid through a company called Halvern Rigging. Then he asked whether she'd ever heard the name. Ivy had counted $1,100 out of a Halvern Rigging envelope on a loading dock in March of her 19th year. She had written the amount down. She said nothing at all. Dante Ferraro looked at her for a moment and then said the first thing that made her genuinely afraid of him, not because it was a threat, but because it was true. You've decided the safest thing you can do is nothing. It isn't. They already came twice. They came twice because they'd rather you hand it over than have to explain a body. Ivy's mouth had gone dry. She asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted the same thing she did from a different direction and that they were both going to lose unless one of them did something ugly and immediate. Then he told her to come inside and hear the rest because he was not going to say it in a car. He laid it out the way a man lays out a contract because that was what it was. He told her that whoever was pulling money out of Harborline was inside his own organization or inside Castellane, and that, until he knew which, he could not act without warning them. He told her that her notebooks were the only object on earth that connected the missing wages to the missing men. He told her that she would be dead inside 2 weeks. Ivy said she'd already worked that part out on her own thanks. He almost smiled. It didn't reach anything. Then he told her the rest. He could put her somewhere. He could pay for her brother. He could make her disappear into a town in another state with a different last name, and it would work for maybe 3 years, and she would spend all 3 of them waiting. Or, he said there was one status in the state of Rhode Island that nobody would touch. Not the crew out of Cranston, not Halvern, not the men who had sat at her bar, a Ferraro wife. Killing a waitress was housekeeping. Killing his wife was a declaration of war against an organization that had never lost one, and there was not a single person on that harbor with the appetite for it. And he said this last flatly without dressing it up as anything but what it was, a wife from outside. The life ended the Brannock question permanently. No alliance, no counsel, no woman selected for him by men who had been selecting things for him since he was 6. He would take the debts, all of them. Danny's rehabilitation, the medical arrears, the collections, the whole crushing weight of it gone inside a week. She would have counsel of her own paid by him, obligated only to her. She would have money in an account he had no access to. Ivy sat with her hands flat on her knees so they wouldn't move. She thought about the fire. She thought about her brother learning to close 3 fingers. She thought about Marisol Duarte, who did not know she was a widow. She thought about the fact that a man was sitting across from her offering to solve every problem she had, and that in her entire 22 years, nobody had ever offered her anything that didn't come with an invoice attached. She said, "Marry you?" He said yes. And then Ivy Calloway did the thing that changed the shape of the next year of both their lives, because she did not say yes and she did not say no. She said, "What's the termination clause?" Winsome. Dante Ferraro had negotiated with men who ran ports unions and $300 million bond issues. He had not in a very long time been asked a question he had not anticipated. He told her there wasn't one yet. Ivy asked for a pencil. He gave her one, and she pulled the pages toward her and read the entire thing, all of it. Every clause slowly, the way she read invoices, and it took 31 minutes, and neither of them spoke for any of it. Twice she made a small mark in the margin. Once she went back 3 pages and read something again. He watched her do it. He would think about that half hour many times afterward, and what he would remember was not her face and not her nerve. It was that she had not skipped anything. Not one line. A girl who had been on fire 18 hours earlier had sat in the office of the most dangerous man in the city and refused to sign something she hadn't read. When she was done, she turned to the last page and wrote 2 sentences in pencil, and then she turned the document around and pushed it back across to him. The first clause said the notebooks remained her sole property and could not be transferred, copied, surrendered, or destroyed by any party other than herself, including in the event of her death. The second clause said this: "If I ever choose to put this record in front of a court, he will not stop me. Not by money, not by lawyers, not by anyone he sends, even if it buries him." Dante read it twice. He said, "You understand what's in that project. Ferraro money is under it. If that record ever comes out, I don't lose an argument. I lose everything my family has left." Ivy said she understood that perfectly well. She said that was why it had to be in writing, because everything else in her life that people had promised her had been said out loud and nowhere else. He looked at the pencil marks for a long moment. Then he said, "Then write it in ink." And he signed it. So they were married 6 days later. Ivy would remember almost none of it because the 6 days were not hers. They belonged to a machine. Attorneys came. A woman arrived with dresses and no opinions. Somebody moved Danny to a private facility in East Greenwich without asking her, and when she found out and started to object, The coordinator handed her the intake paperwork with Ivy Calloway's sole decision-making authority typed at the top of it, and she stopped mid-sentence and had to look at the wall for a while. She learned things about him in those 6 days that she filed away without knowing what to do with. She learned that he had a room prepared for her and it was not his room. She learned that when one of the men from the Rialto crew tried to speak to her in a parking garage, the man was simply not in Providence anymore by that evening, and that nobody explained this to her and nobody expected her to be grateful for it. She learned that he sent her the full legal structure of his companies, unredacted 4 days before the wedding, the real ones, the clean ones, everything a wife would gain access to, and that when she asked why, he said only that her brother's paperwork had been used against her for a year, and he was not going to be the second person to do it. And she learned what the city thought, because the city found out on day 3, and the city rendered its verdict in about 40 minutes, and the verdict was the oldest one there is, $2 million. A waitress. Everybody understood. She heard it in the pharmacy. She heard it from a girl she'd worked doubles with for 2 years who stopped texting. She heard it from a woman at the fitting who thought she was out of earshot and wasn't. Nobody said hostage. Nobody said survivor. Everybody said bought. And they said it with a small, satisfied smile because it was the version that required no one to think about anything. Ivy stopped correcting people on day 4. On day 5, she stood in front of a mirror and understood that she was about to walk into a room full of people who had already decided what she was, and she made a decision about it. She had spent 3 years shrinking. Making herself unremarkable had been the only defense she had. It hadn't worked. They'd found her anyway. They'd burned her drawer anyway. So she was done with it. There was no one to walk her down the aisle. Her mother had been gone since she was 15. Her father had been gone longer and less honorably. Danny couldn't stand. Somebody from Dante's staff had suggested delicately that an uncle could be arranged. Ivy had said no. She walked it alone, and she walked it slowly, and she kept her chin up the entire way, and she felt every eye in that room doing the arithmetic on her, the age, the hair, the fact that 6 days ago she'd been carrying a tray. She let them. She had counted worse things than a room full of people. Dante watched her come the whole distance. He would not have been able to explain afterward why that was the moment something shifted. He had married her for a reason he could have written on an index card, but he had assumed without examining the assumption that she would need something, a hand, an arm, a prop. She arrived with nothing, and she arrived on time, and when she stopped beside him, her hands were steady. His uncle Sal was in the second row. Sal Ferraro was 61 and had buried 2 brothers and had been the one to teach Dante how to hold a room, and he clapped louder than anybody in the building. He also watched Ivy Calloway for the entire ceremony without blinking once, and later, at the reception, when she passed his table, he touched her elbow and told her she had lovely handwriting. Ivy stopped walking. She had never met this man in her life. There was no reason on earth he should have known what her handwriting looked like. She said thank you, and she kept moving, and she did not tell anyone, and she filed it away next to everything else. The ring went on. She looked down at it and thought with a strange, detached calm that it weighed more than it should. And then there was dinner, and there were toasts, and there were 300 people, and then there weren't, and then it was almost 11 o'clock. And Ivy Calloway was standing alone in a room she had been in twice, wearing something she had chosen herself, listening to the sound of her own heart. She had told herself all week that she had thought this part through. She had not. She had thought about the legal structure, the accounts, the clause she wrote in ink, the way she would speak to his family, whether she should keep working. She had built a whole architecture of practical decisions to stand inside, and every one of them collapsed the second she heard footsteps in the corridor. Because the contract said one thing and the world said another, and the world had been saying it for 6 days in every pharmacy and parking lot in Providence. $2 million. Everybody understood. And Ivy, who had read every line, who had negotiated her own terms in pencil, who had made a Mafia Boss sign a clause that could destroy him, Ivy did not entirely believe that a piece of paper would matter at 11 o'clock at night in a room with a locked door. The footsteps stopped. The handle turned. He came in with his jacket gone and his collar open, and Ivy's eyes went straight to the ink on his throat before she could stop them. And then she looked at his face, and the door clicked shut behind him. Neither of them said anything. Ivy's fingers closed around the fabric at her side. She heard her own breathing and hated the sound of it. He crossed the room slowly. She took one step back, then another. Then the backs of her legs met the bed and there was nowhere else. And she stopped and she lifted her chin because whatever happened, she was not going to beg. She had done many things in 22 years, but she had never begged and she was not going to start on a night the whole city thought it had already paid for. He stopped in front of her. His eyes went to her hands, which were shaking so badly that the fabric was moving. And he raised his own hand toward her shoulder. Ivy saw it coming and flinched. Her whole body did it at once, shoulders up, head turned, eyes shut, a reflex older than the marriage, older than the fire, older than the notebooks. The reflex of a person who has learned that when someone with power reaches for you, the reaching is not a question. Dante froze. His hand stopped in the air 6 inches from her, and it did not move. The silence went on so long that Ivy finally opened her eyes. And she saw something on his face that she had absolutely not been prepared for. Not anger, not impatience, not amusement. He looked like a man who had just found out what he was, because he understood in that half second exactly what she had spent 6 days believing. Not that she was nervous, not that she was overwhelmed, that she believed he had come to collect. He lowered his hand. Then he stepped back, not far, not theatrically, just far enough that the air between them belonged to her again. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "You think I bought you?" Ivy's throat had closed. She made herself answer anyway, and her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "Everyone in this city thinks so, including you 6 days ago." Something moved across his face at that. He did not deny it. He said the agreement had given her his name. He said it had given her his protection and his lawyers and access to everything that came with being a Ferraro, and that all of that was hers from tonight and could not be taken back. "It did not give me your body. It was never on the table. It is never going to be on the table." Ivy stared at him. She had spent 6 days preparing for a lie. She had not prepared at all for this, and she found that she had no idea what to do with her hands. He didn't soften it. He didn't reassure her or smile or step forward to prove he was safe. He just stated it the way he'd state a boundary line on a survey, and somehow that was the only reason on earth she believed him. Then he crossed the room again slowly, so slowly that she had every second she needed to move away. She didn't move away. He stopped within reach. His hand came up and stopped short, hovering beside her shoulder, not touching, waiting. And Ivy understood what he was doing, and something inside her chest cracked straight down the middle. Because she was 22 years old, and her father had signed her school forms without reading them, and her landlord had entered her apartment without knocking. And a doctor had explained her brother's spine to a case manager instead of to her, and an insurance company had decided in 17 days that Danny had never been on that platform, and two men had sat at her bar and named a price for the only thing she owned, and somebody had lit her bedroom on fire while she was at work. Nobody had asked her anything, not once, not in her whole life. His fingertips touched the fabric at her shoulder, barely so light she could almost have imagined it. His thumb moved a fraction of an inch, then he stopped again. And Dante Ferraro, who could empty a room in this city without raising his voice, who had men in 3 states who moved when he told them to, who had just spent $2 million and a marriage on a woman he had known for 6 days, asked for the one thing in the world he could not take. "May I continue?" Ivy Calloway's breath caught in her chest. And in the silence after those 4 words, she realized that the most dangerous man in Providence had just handed her something her own family never had, and that she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do with it. She said yes, not loudly, not steadily either. But she said it, and the word came out of her own mouth on her own decision, and that was the first thing in 14 months that had. His hand settled fully against her shoulder then, warm, still asking nothing. He didn't pull her closer. He didn't lean in. He stood there and let her get used to the fact that a man's hand could rest on her without becoming a demand. And Ivy closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Not from fear this time, but because she needed to be alone with what her body was doing. Then he lifted his hand away. She felt the absence of it. That was the part that unsettled her. He walked to the sitting area and took the chair farthest from the bed, and to her total disbelief, he pulled a folder out from under his arm and started reading. Ivy made a sound that was almost a laugh. He looked up. She shook her head. There was nothing to say. She sat down on the edge of the mattress with her hands in her lap and watched the most feared man in Providence go through a stack of vendor invoices on his wedding night and after about 20 minutes, she stopped being afraid and started being furious, not at him, at herself for how badly she had needed someone to prove her wrong. At midnight, he closed the folder and stood, and her stomach dropped again out of pure reflex. He crossed to the door and stopped. If you need anything, there's a line downstairs. Anytime. You don't have to have a reason. Then he was gone, and Ivy sat alone in a room bigger than the apartment she'd lost, holding her own wrist to feel her pulse slow down, and she did not sleep for a very long time. Not because she was frightened, because she was curious, and curiosity was a thing she hadn't been able to afford in years. In the morning, there was a tray by the window and a folded note on it in handwriting, so economical it was almost rude. Eat. You didn't touch anything last night. Ivy read it twice and laughed out loud alone at 7 in the morning, and then felt strange about laughing. She ate. By day 4, she had stopped waiting to be told where she could go. By day 9, she had learned which of the house staff had kids, which guard worked the overnight, and that the kitchen supplier delivered late every Thursday, and nobody had ever said anything because the driver's wife was sick. By day 11, she had asked the housekeeper for a second lamp and a heavier blanket. And when both appeared within the hour, she understood that nobody in this house had ever been given permission to say no to her. That should have felt good. It made her skin crawl. She had spent 3 years being the person who wrote things down for men. Nobody listened to, and now she was the one nobody argued with. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line in the wrong direction. She went to see Danny twice a week. The new facility had a therapy pool and a nutritionist and a physical therapist who did not sigh when Danny got tired, and Ivy hated how much better he looked because every improvement was a receipt. You keep looking at me like I'm a purchase, Danny told her the second week. You are. No, I'm what he paid for the thing you didn't sell. He was quiet a second. There's a difference. You should figure out what it is before it eats you. She didn't have an answer for that. She drove back across the bay with her jaw locked. And that afternoon, entirely by accident, she found the thing that changed everything. She hadn't gone into his study to snoop. She'd gone in because the light was better on that side of the house, and she was reading a lease agreement. Her own attorney had sent her the attorney who worked for her and only her, which was a sentence she still couldn't say without hearing it as a joke. The Harborline Quarterly Cost Report was on the corner of the desk, face up 3 inches from her elbow. She read the first page because it was there. She read the second page because the first one bothered her. By the 4th page, she had stopped breathing normally. Halvern Rigging loaded $241,000 in equipment rental across 11 weeks. Ivy had counted $1,100 out of a Halvern Rigging envelope on a loading dock in March of her 19th year, standing in the cold, with a flashlight in her teeth, writing the amount in a spiral notebook, because a man named Teodoro had been shorted 12 hours and had no other way to prove it. Halvern Rigging had no employees. She knew that the way she knew her own phone number. Halvern had never filed a single hour of payroll in the state of Rhode Island. She had checked 8 months ago on a library computer because she'd been trying to find someone to sue. And here it was on a legitimate cost report, renting equipment to a $900 million development. She was still standing there with the page in her hand when the door opened. He looked at the report. He looked at her. Ivy's first instinct was the old one: put it down, apologize, make herself small. She actually felt her shoulders start to do it. She stopped them. This company doesn't exist, she said. I've been paid to buy it. He didn't ask what she was doing in his study. He didn't ask her to explain herself. He crossed the room, took the page out of her hand and said, show me. So she showed him. She showed him the escalation pattern, the way the rental figures climbed by 4 to 6% a month, never more, because more would trip a threshold review. She showed him the same equipment billed to 2 projects in the same 3-week window. She showed him a mobilization fee charged twice on a crane that had never been demobilized in between. He asked how she caught it. Ivy told him the truth, which was that people are bad at hiding money. Everybody thinks they're good at it. They think if they scatter it, it disappears. But money is heavy. It leaves the same drag marks every time. And if you've spent 3 years watching envelopes come in short, you stop looking for the theft and start looking for the rhythm. He made one phone call that lasted 40 seconds. Then he said, I'm bringing in my accountants tonight. Stay. It was not a request, and it was also not an order. And Ivy realized she had no category for whatever it was. She stayed. They worked for 31 hours, two forensic accountants, his CFO, and a 22-year-old former waitress at the end of the conference table with her shoes off and her hair coming down and a pencil between her teeth. Hour one, the CFO addressed everything to Dante and nothing to her. Hour six, one of the accountants asked her a question directly and then looked faintly surprised at himself. Hour 19, the CFO said, "Mrs. Ferraro, can you pull the March mobilizations?" And Ivy answered without noticing what he'd called her. Hour 24, they had it. $1.8 million out through 7 shell vendors over 14 months. But that wasn't what made Ivy stand up so fast her chair went over backward. Because she'd been sorting the vendors by payment date, and she'd noticed that Halvern and a second shell Quonset Marine Services paid out in a pattern that had nothing to do with equipment. Equipment invoices come at month end. These came on Thursdays. Every Thursday, in amounts that were never round. Cash wages come out on Thursday so the men can be paid Friday. Ivy pulled her own memory apart in front of 4 strangers and rebuilt it out loud. Teodoro, March 1100. Bashir. That August, 940. The crew on the East tie-in 7100 split 6 ways in the first week of September. Every one of those envelopes had come out of Halvern or Quonset, the same 2 companies. The theft and the cash payroll were running through the identical pipe. "It's not 2 things," she said. Her voice didn't sound like hers. "It's 1 thing. He's not stealing around the off-book crews. He's stealing through them. That's the whole point of them." The room went silent. Because she was right, and everybody at that table understood it at the same moment. You cannot pull $1.8 million out of a project this size without a category no auditor is allowed to open. And there is only 1 category on any construction site on Earth that nobody is permitted to audit: the money paid to men who legally were never there. The 9 men on that lift weren't collateral damage. They were the mechanism. Somebody had needed a class of human being who could not appear on a document because that was the only place the money could hide. Dante hadn't spoken in 10 minutes. When he finally did, his voice had gone somewhere flat and cold. "Say the last part again." Ivy looked at him. "2 men died so a line item could stay empty," she said. "That's it. That's the whole crime." He dismissed the accountants at 4 in the morning. Ivy stayed at the table with her hands flat on the wood coming down off 31 hours, shaking a little. He poured 2 glasses of water and put one in front of her, and then he said the thing she had been dreading since hour 19. "Whoever approved those vendors is inside my organization. Not Castellane, mine." She had known. She'd known since she saw the second signature block. She hadn't said it, saying it out loud made it real, and because a small, ugly part of her had been calculating what a man like him did about betrayal and how much of it she wanted to be responsible for. He watched her not saying it. "You already knew," he said, "since 11 o'clock. And you didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" Ivy looked up at him, exhausted past the point of managing her own face. "Because I've spent a year trying to figure out who to hand this to. And every single time I picked someone, they turned out to be the person I was hiding from." He absorbed that. Then he said something that would sit in her chest for months. "Then don't hand it to me. Keep it. Just stop lying about what's in it." And Ivy, who had lied about that notebook to a detective, a fire marshal, 2 men at her own bar, and her brother's insurance adjuster, put her head down on the table and cried for the first time since the fire. He didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. He just didn't leave. 3 days later, he gave her a job. Not symbolic, signature authority over internal spend across 4 of the legitimate Ferraro companies, an office, a title, and a salary that made her lightheaded. Ivy read the whole packet, all of it, every line, because that was who she was now. And then she said she didn't want the office. He frowned. "It's a corner. It has the harbor view. Your study has better light in the afternoon, and I already know where everything is." He stared at her for a second like she'd told him she preferred to work in a closet. The corner office stayed empty. Her notebooks migrated onto the far end of his conference table, then the near end, then somehow into the second drawer of his own desk, and he never once said a word about it. Ivy noticed later that he stopped scheduling calls in there between 2 and 5, because that was when the light was good. The first week she walked into a vendor meeting, a regional director named Pell greeted. Dante greeted the CFO and then asked Ivy if she could get someone to bring coffee. 14 men heard it. Ivy did not look at Dante. That was the important part, and she knew it in the half second she had to decide. If she looked at him, Pell won, because Pell would have proved that she needed the room's real authority to answer for her. So she sat down, opened her binder, and said, "Sure. Right after you explain the 11% line on your February close, because I've got you at 406,000 and your own summary says 361. Pell said something about reconciliation timing. Ivy said, "It's not timing. You billed the same subcontract twice under two names. Page 9 of yours, page 4 of mine." The room got extremely quiet. Pell's account was restructured inside a month. Ivy did not gloat about it, and she did not think about it again, which was how she learned that she was better at this than she'd let herself believe. The second week, nobody sent her for coffee. By the sixth week, a project manager out of Warwick came to her first before Dante, with a problem about a supplier because, as he explained, awkwardly sweating, she was the one who actually read the paperwork. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without either of them agreeing to it, they started sharing a life. He hated mushrooms with an intensity that struck her as childish, and she started removing them from things without comment. She drank tea after 4 and coffee never, and by the second month, there was a specific tin in the kitchen that nobody else touched. He worked past 2 most nights unless food was physically placed in front of him. She took her shoes off when she was concentrating and left them wherever they landed, and once she came in and found them lined up by the door, and she looked at that for a full 30 seconds and had to go stand by the window. He learned to read her silences. There were two. One meant she was doing arithmetic in her head and would surface in about 4 minutes. The other meant something had gotten past her defenses, and when that one happened, he didn't ask about it, he just got quieter too and stayed in the room. She learned to read his shoulders. When he'd spent the night dealing with the other side of the Pharaoh name, the side she never entered, the side he never brought home, he stood differently. The next morning, and he stood by the windows longer, and he didn't touch his coffee until it was cold. She never asked, he never offered. She told herself she was fine with that. She was 70% fine with that. The night of the first real storm in November, she'd been on cost projections for 6 hours and her neck had gone to concrete. She rubbed at it without thinking. He looked up. She pretended not to notice. A minute later, he came around the desk and stopped behind her chair. And Ivy's body did the old thing, a small tightening across the shoulders, the leftover of a night in October she still hadn't finished thinking about. He felt it. He always felt it. He started to step back, and Ivy heard herself say before she could stop it, "You can continue." He went very still. Then his hands settled on her shoulders, the same place, the exact same place, and his thumbs worked at the base of her neck, and Ivy let out a breath she'd apparently been holding since August. Neither of them said anything for 4 or 5 minutes. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the projection sheet in front of her, and the number on it was bad, and out of pure fatigue, she said, "We can't keep bleeding money like this. That's our margin walking out the door." His hand stopped. Ivy heard it a half second after she said it. Our, not his, not the family's, not the company's. She turned her head. He was looking down at her, and something in his face had come open in a way she'd never seen on it. She stood up. His hands fell away. They were maybe 8 inches apart. She could see the stubble along his jaw and the ink at the base of his throat where his collar sat open, and she thought with an odd calm that she had been looking at that spot on purpose for about 3 weeks and pretending she wasn't. He lifted one hand slowly and moved a strand of hair off her cheek. She didn't flinch. He noticed that too. She saw him notice it. And then Ivy Calloway, who had negotiated her own marriage in pencil, closed the 8 inches herself. It was not gentle, and it was not careful, and it had 11 weeks behind it. He stayed absolutely still for the first half second. She understood later that he'd been making certain that he would always be making certain. And then his arm went around her waist, and he pulled her in, and she felt exactly how much strength he was not using. When they finally broke apart, she couldn't get her breath right. He rested his forehead against hers. "I need you to say something," he said low. "Anything. I'm not going to guess with you." "You're a lot of work," she said. He laughed. She had never heard him do it. It was a rough, unpracticed sound like a door that hadn't been opened in years. 2 days later, she met Vivienne Castellone. The Castellane Group had resurrected 3 dead port cities, and Vivienne had done it herself from nothing, in an industry that had spent 40 years explaining to her why she couldn't. She was 54. She had a handshake like a contract closing. And within 11 minutes of meeting Ivy, she had mentioned the Rialto 3 times. Not cruelly. That was the craft of it. Once as a compliment, service work teaches you more about people than an MBA does. Once as a joke at her own expense. Once in passing to someone else. As an introduction, Ivy came up through hospitality. Ivy counted them. Ivy counted everything. Then Vivian walked her to the window and offered her a job. Community liaison, advisory role on Harborline. 2 days a week, no fixed deliverables reporting directly to Vivian, and a number that would have taken Ivy 9 years to earn at the bar. You know these crews, Vivian said warmly. You know their families. Nobody in my organization has that. I'd be a fool not to want it. And Ivy, standing there with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, understood the shape of it perfectly. It wasn't a bribe. Bribes are crude. This was better. This was a payroll. The moment she took it, every word she ever said about Harborline became the opinion of a Castellane employee, and every document she produced became the property of a company that could sue her for it. She was being bought so professionally that she was expected to be flattered. Ivy set the glass down. That's very generous, she said, but I already have a job where I read the invoices, and I'd hate to give it up for one where I don't. Vivian's smile didn't move. Her eyes did. That's a shame, she said. You'd have been useful. I'm counting on it, Ivy said. The last thing that happened before the world came apart happened at a family dinner she hadn't wanted to attend. Sal Ferraro was seated 4 places down. He'd been perfectly warm all evening, asked after Danny, by name remembered which facility, told a long story about Dante at 9 years old that made even Dante's mouth twitch. When Ivy got up, he touched her elbow the way he had at the wedding. You're good for him, Sal said. He's happier than I've seen him. I mean that. Thank you. And held on a second longer than he needed to. Just be careful with all that paper you're carrying around, sweetheart, he said pleasantly, still smiling, still holding her elbow. Paper's a funny thing, fragile, it burns. Ivy stood in the hallway afterward with her heart going so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Because at the wedding, a man who had never met her had complimented her handwriting. And now he had used the word burns at a dinner table out loud, in front of nobody, to a woman whose bedroom had been set on fire 8 weeks earlier. She went home and did not tell Dante. She told herself it was because she had no proof, which was true, and because Sal was the last living man who had stood at his father's funeral, which was also true. But underneath both of those, there was a third reason, and Ivy was honest enough with herself to name it at 3 in the morning while she stared at the ceiling. She didn't tell him because she had finally stupidly started to be happy, and she knew that the second she said her uncle-in-law's name out loud, the marriage that had begun as a contract and turned into something she couldn't name would have to become a war. She had 11 more days before it did. She just didn't know it yet. It rained for all 9 days of it, and Ivy would remember that detail long after she'd forgotten the name of the hearing officer. She sat alone at the petitioner's table. That had been a fight. Dante's counsel had drafted an appearance and Ivy had read it and handed it back and said no. And when the attorney started to explain what a self-represented petitioner looks like to a commission, she said she understood perfectly, and that was the point. If a Ferrero lawyer stood up in that room, the story became a mob family settling a score inside a rival's project. If a 22-year-old stood up with a banker's box, the story became what it actually was. Dante sat in the 4th row on the aisle and did not speak to a single witness for 9 days. Castellane brought 6 attorneys and 2 paralegals and a projector. Ivy's opening statement was 4 minutes long, and she had rewritten it 40 times, and in the end she threw all 40 away the night before and wrote something on an index card at 3 in the morning. She stood up and said she wasn't a lawyer. She said she had never done this before and would probably do parts of it wrong. She said the commission was going to hear a great deal over the next 2 weeks about bonding covenants and labor projections and safety protocols, and that she wanted to say one thing before any of that started. There were 9 men on that lift, she said. 6 of them were paid in cash. 2 of them died, and for 14 months, the official position of the state of Rhode Island has been that they were never there. I'm not here to argue about who's responsible. I'm here to argue that they existed. Then she sat down. Castellane's lead counsel, a man named Alden Roach, who had been doing this for 31 years, spent 45 minutes explaining that the petitioner had no standing, no documentation from any regulated source, and a demonstrable personal interest in the outcome. He was very good. Ivy took notes the whole time because he kept telling her what he was afraid of. Day 2, Roche moved to exclude the entire evidentiary package. His argument was clean. None of it came from a regulated custodian. There was no chain of custody. It was, he said, a collection of grocery receipts in church ledgers assembled by an interested party with a personal grievance. Ivy stood up when the officer looked at her. She said the respondent was correct that none of her exhibits came from a regulated custodian. Roach allowed himself to look pleased. That's the point, Ivy said. Every regulated custodian in this matter had a financial reason to leave these men off. That's not an accident, that's the design. The reason my exhibits come from a check casher on Cranston Street and a parish on Pine Street is that those are the only two places in this state that had no incentive to lie about whether Emiliano Duarte was alive. The hearing officer denied the motion. Roach filed it again on day 4 in a different form and again on day 6, and that was when Ivy understood she was actually winning something, because a man doesn't file the same motion 3 times if he thinks the first denial was a fluke. Marisol Duarte testified on the morning of day 3. Ivy had one question ready and never asked it because Marisol did not need to be led anywhere. She sat down, gave her name, gave her husband's name, and then said in a voice that carried to the back wall that for 14 months she had told her daughter that her father might come back. Because nobody ever gave me a paper, she said. In this country, if you don't have paper, nothing happened. So I tell my daughter maybe he is somewhere. Maybe he forgot us. I make my husband a bad man in my own house, because that is easier than nothing. Roach did not cross-examine her. I was too smart, too. But Ivy watched 2 of the commissioners stop writing, and she understood something about hearings that no attorney had ever explained to her, that the record is made of documents, but the room is made of people. Then Ivy entered Exhibit 4149 Western Union receipts, the 4th of the month, 4 years running, ending on September 4th. And Exhibit 42, which was one sheet of paper and which was the moment the room changed. It was the phone log, Bashir Nazari 6:41 m, September 9th. 4 minutes and 11 seconds to a number in Kabul. Ivy said the respondent's position is that Mr. Nazari was never on that site. At 6:41 that morning, he called his brother the way he did every Tuesday to say he was going to work. 81 minutes later, the lift failed. The respondent's incident report was filed at 3:20 that afternoon. It lists 3 names. Roach objected on relevance. The officer overruled him and asked for the exhibit to be read into the record aloud. Danny came in on day 4. He had transferred out of the chair into a walker 11 days earlier and had not told his sister because he wanted to come through those doors upright and he'd been terrified she'd talk him out of it. It took him 90 seconds to cross the room. Nobody said a word for the entire 90 seconds. He testified that he had been on the 4th floor tie-in on the morning of September 9th. He testified that there were 9 men on the platform. He named all 9. Roche stood up for cross, and he was careful because a jury, even a commission, does not enjoy watching a man in a walker get taken apart. He asked whether Mr. Calloway's memory of that morning might be affected by the traumatic nature of the event and the medication he'd been on since. It might, Danny said. That's why my sister wrote it down. Your sister's notebooks aren't in evidence. No, sir. Somebody burned them. Roche should have stopped there. He'd made his point, and he had a clean exit, and Ivy watched him decide to take one more step, and she felt something cold and electric go up her arms. Isn't it true, Mr. Calloway, that your medical care is currently being funded by the Ferraro family? Danny looked at him for a second. Yes, he said, since October. Before that, it wasn't funded by anybody because your client's insurance carrier denied my claim in 17 days on the grounds that I wasn't on the payroll. He shifted his weight on the walker. So if you want to explain to this room how I couldn't have been on that lift because I'm not in your paperwork, and also that my sister is lying because somebody finally paid for my spine, sir, you can't have both. Pick one. The hearing officer called a 15-minute recess. Ivy sat in a stairwell and shook for 11 of them. Vivienne Castellone took the chair on the morning of day 6, and she was magnificent. That was the honest word for it, and Ivy never once pretended otherwise. Vivienne testified for 4 hours without a single evasion. She did not blame a subcontractor. She did not claim ignorance. She explained the financing structure of a $900 million public-private development in language that 3 commissioners visibly understood for the first time in their lives. And then she explained what happens to a bonded project when a fatality involving undocumented labor enters the record. The syndicate pulls, the covenant triggers, the site dies. I want to be very clear about something, she said, because I think this proceeding has been operating on a fiction. Everyone in this room knows how construction labor works in this state. Everyone. The inspectors know. The commission knows. The legislature that passed the bond package knows. I am not on trial for a secret. I am on trial for the part everybody agreed not to say out loud, and I'm the only one who showed up. It was Ivy, thought the single most effective thing anyone said in 9 days. By the lunch recess, 3 separate reporters had filed pieces framing Vivian as a pragmatist being scapegoated by a mafia wife. Ivy had 1 hour to cross-examine her, and she'd been preparing for it for 5 weeks. She threw out every question she had. She'd watched Vivian dismantle a room by being reasonable, and she understood that if she argued, she lost because Vivian was better at arguing than anyone Ivy had ever met and had a full generation of practice on her. So Ivy did not argue. She handed up a document instead. Ms. Castellane, this is respondent's own daily site closure log for September 9th through September 12th. Would you read the entry for September 9th? Vivian read it. Site closed following incident 8:15 a.m. All personnel cleared. No labor performed September 9 through 12. Thank you. This is Exhibit 88, a wire transfer record from Quonset Marine Services dated September 11th in the amount of $6,420. Do you know what that payment was for? I don't. This is Exhibit 89. It's a statement from a check casher on Manton Avenue. 6 men cashed payroll advances from Quonset on September 12th. Their names are listed. 4 of them are on the list of 9 my brother testified to. The room was very quiet. Ms. Castellane, Ivy said, your site was closed, nobody worked, and a company you contracted with paid 6 men for a week that didn't happen. I have 31 more of these going back 19 months. So I'd like to ask you a question, and I'm not being clever, I actually want to know the answer. Vivian waited. If the off-book crews were just a labor cost you tolerated, Ivy said, why were they still getting paid when there was no work? Who was that money actually for? Vivian Castellane did not answer for 4 seconds. Ivy would think about those 4 seconds for years, because in them, she watched something enormous happen behind a woman's face. The moment a person who believes she has been protecting the project realizes she has been the cover for a theft. I'd have to review the vendor file, Vivian said. Have you ever reviewed it? No. Who approved Quonset? Roche was on his feet. The officer let the question stand. That would be the Capital Partners designee, Vivian said. Would you say the name for the record? Salvatore Ferraro. Sal was indicted on the morning of day 7. Not by the commission had no such power. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been running parallel the whole time, and Adaeze Okoro had been sitting in the back of that hearing room since day 1 taking notes, and the moment Vivian Castellane said her Capital Partners designee had approved payroll on a closed site, the last piece went in. Wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction for the notebooks. Ivy found out from a reporter shouting a question at her in the corner. She had to put her hand on the wall. She turned around and looked back into the hearing room, and Dante was still sitting in the 4th row on the aisle, exactly where he'd been for 6 days, and he had not moved and would not move because there were federal agents in that building and a protective order with his name on it. His uncle had just been indicted on evidence his wife had built, and he sat there with his hands in his lap and did not react, and Ivy understood what that cost him better than anyone alive. She didn't go to him. She couldn't. She went back in and did day 7. So day 8 was Halvern rigging, and Halvern rigging was where it stopped being about 2 dead men and started being about a machine. Ivy walked the commission through it in 90 minutes slowly, the way she'd once walked 4 accountants through it at a conference table with her shoes off. Halvern had no employees, no equipment, no insurance until a rider was purchased in the name of an authorized officer, and no function except to be a place where money could be described. Quonset was the same. Together, they had moved just over $1.8 million out of Harborline in 14 months, and every dollar of it had been laundered through a labor category that could never be audited. I want to be precise about this, Ivy said, because I think it's the only thing that matters. My petition isn't that these men were treated badly. Men get treated badly on every site in this country. My petition is that their invisibility was the product. Somebody didn't tolerate an off-book crew. Somebody needed one because an undocumented worker is the only line item in American construction that nobody is allowed to check. You can't steal money through a category that gets audited. So they built one that doesn't. She let that sit. Emiliano Duarte and Bashir Nazari didn't die because the safety system failed them. They died in a system that required them not to exist in order to function. That's not negligence. That's design. Roche asked for a continuance. The officer denied it. That night, Ivy came home and found the house dark and Dante on the floor of the study with his back against the desk and an open bottle he hadn't touched. She sat down on the floor next to him, not close. "Say it," she said. "There's nothing to say." "There's about 9 days of it." He was quiet for a long moment. "He taught me to drive," Dante said. My father was not around and Sal took me out to the lot behind the fish pier when I was 14 and let me put his car in a fence. He paid for my mother's roof in 2009 and never told her it was him. He carried one end of my father's casket. "I know. And he sat at my wedding and complimented your handwriting. He laughed and it was a terrible sound. He was measuring you. At my wedding, he was already deciding." Ivy didn't say anything. "I'm not angry at you," he said. "I want you to hear me say that once out loud because you're going to spend the next 20 years waiting for me to be." Her eyes stung. Yes, that's exactly what I was doing." "I know. I've watched you do it since March." He turned his head. "Ivy, ask me the thing you've been not asking me." She almost didn't, then she did. "If I'd come to you in December," she said before I filed, "if I'd said this ends, your company helped me bury it instead, would you have paid 5 million, 10, whatever it took to make it go away?" He answered immediately, and that was the part that undid her. "Yes." "You?" "Immediately, without asking a second question." He looked at her steadily. "And I'd have thought you were wrong every minute of it, and I would never have said so because it had to be yours. If I only back you when you're right, that's not support. That's supervision." Ivy put her face in her hands. She had spent her whole life around people who helped her, and every single one of them had handed her an invoice afterward. Her father, landlords, managers, the insurance adjuster who'd been so kind on the phone before the denial letter, Sal with his 5 million and his state of her choosing, Vivian with a 6-figure liaison job and a smile. Every act of assistance she had ever received had been a purchase order. And this man had spent $2 million on her in a week and had never once, not a single time, presented the bill. "I don't know how to be given something," she said muffled. There's no place in me that knows how to do that." "I know," he said. "That's why I keep asking first." The commission ruled on the 22nd. Ivy read it in a hallway on her phone standing up and had to read the first paragraph 3 times because the words wouldn't hold still. Castellane Group's contractor license suspended statewide 24 months pending compliance restructuring. 3 executives referred for prosecution, fraud, falsification of safety records, obstruction. Alden Roach's motion to seal denied, and the finding that Ivy had written the entire petition around the one she had not let herself hope for. The commission found as a matter of fact that 9 workers were present on the personnel lift on September 9th, and that Emiliano Duarte and Bashir Nazari sustained fatal injuries in the course of employment. 14 months after they died, the state of Rhode Island permitted them to be dead. The legislature moved faster than anyone expected, because a bond package with 4 votes of margin is a fragile thing, and every legislator who'd voted for it wanted to be photographed fixing it. $40 million funded jointly out of the settlement and the state's uninsured employer fund for workers with no employment record. Marisol Duarte was the first claimant. Bashir's brother in Kabul was the fourth. And in a paragraph, nobody outside a few offices noticed the state amended its incident reporting standard so that every individual physically present at a worksite fatality had to be identified in the report, regardless of employment status. 6 lines of statutory language. Ivy had counted envelopes in a parking lot for 3 years to get 6 lines. She thought it was the best trade she'd ever made. There was no celebration. She'd expected she wasn't sure what. Something. Some feeling of arrival. What she got was a bad night, then another one, then a week of them waking at 4 in the morning with her heart going and nothing to do about it. She'd been carrying it since she was 19. It turned out the carrying had been holding her together. Dante didn't try to fix it. He didn't make speeches. He rearranged his week so he was in the house at 4 in the morning, and when she came downstairs, he was awake, and neither of them ever named the arrangement out loud. On the eighth night, she came down and he was at the table with 2 cups of tea already made, and Ivy stood in the doorway and looked at that for a long time. I keep waiting for the bill, she said. I know. That's not fair to you. It's completely fair to me. He pushed 1 cup across. You've never had a version of this that didn't come with one. Why would you assume mine's different? You'd be an idiot. She sat down. Her hands were around the cup. Sal offered me $5 million to walk, she said. In the library, in February. I never told you. I assumed. You call. He's my uncle. Of course he did. He almost smiled. Did you ever consider it? Ivy thought about lying. For about 9 seconds, she said. In the car. Danny's care for life. Then I thought about Marisol telling her kid he might come back. 9 seconds is fine. Is it, Ivy? He set his cup down. If it had been 0, you wouldn't have understood what you were choosing. 9 seconds is what it costs to actually decide something. She told him 3 nights later, and it was almost an accident. They were on the study floor again. It had become a place, somehow that floor, going through the registry proposals she'd started drafting because she couldn't sit still, and paperwork was the only sedative that had ever worked on her. He said something about the 24-hour rule she'd written into it, that the contractors would fight it. And Ivy said, let them. And then she said, I love you in exactly the same tone without any transition at all, like it was the next line in a paragraph. Dante Ferraro went completely still. Ivy heard it about a second later and felt her whole face go hot. That wasn't, she put her hand over her eyes. God, I've been holding that since November, and it just came out with the contractors. He didn't say anything. She looked up. And the most feared man in Providence, who negotiated 8-figure positions without changing expression, who had sat through 9 days of his own family's destruction, without moving a muscle, looked completely and utterly unprepared. Say it again, he said. His voice had gone rough. I love you. His hand came up to the back of her neck, and his forehead came down against hers, and when he finally spoke, it was the least controlled she had ever heard him. I've been in love with you since you asked me what the termination clause was. Ivy made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else entirely. That was day 1. I'm aware. You waited 10 months. You'd been sold to me, he said. You were 22, and you'd been on fire, and you thought I'd bought you, and every person in your life who ever wanted something from you asked for it while you had no room to say no. His thumb moved along her jaw. So I decided I'd rather want you for 10 months than ask you for anything before you were free to answer. Ivy's eyes spilled over and she didn't bother to stop it. He kissed her the way he did everything, which was carefully, and this time she was the one who pulled him closer, and neither of them thought about the contract or the money or the 9 days or the $2 million or the room in Providence where 300 people had watched her walk in alone. Nothing in her life had ever been given to her. This had been. 10 months later, the harbor was still going up, and Ivy Calloway had become the most hated woman in the Rhode Island construction industry. She found that out from a trade publication that ran a profile calling her the 23-year-old bottleneck, and she cut it out and taped it to the wall above her desk, and when Dante saw it, he laughed for a full 10 seconds, which she had by then learned was the equivalent of another man falling on the floor. The thing they hated was 4 pages long and called the Harbor Registry. Every worker on every site with Ferraro Capital in it got entered within 24 hours of setting foot on the property. Name, photo, emergency contact, next of kin, the address where money got sent. Paper and digital. 3 copies, 1 held by the contractor, 1 by the registry office, and 1 deposited with a neutral custodian off-site, which in practice meant a parish on Pine Street and a check casher on Cranston, because Ivy had learned exactly which institutions in this city had never had a reason to lie. Immigration status was not a field. It wasn't on the form, there was nowhere to put it deliberately, and Ivy had fought 2 lawyers for 6 weeks over that. It was not charity. That was the part the trade press never got right. It was a contract condition. You didn't sign the registry, you didn't get the pour. And Ferraro Holdings had $400 million in that harbor and could afford to mean it. 3 general contractors screamed. 2 of them sued. Both suits died in 90 days. And then 8 months in Brennick Vale, which had no Ferraro money in it at all, and had opposed the registry publicly and expensively, quietly adopted the standard on its own sites because its insurance underwriter had started pricing registry compliance into premiums. That was the day Ivy understood she'd won something that would outlive her. She didn't celebrate. She went and got a coffee and sat in her car for 20 minutes and thought about a man named Teodoro who'd been shorted 12 hours in March of her 19th year, and how nobody had ever apologized to him, and how he was now a photograph and a phone number in a file that a court could subpoena. Danny walked into her office in June on two canes and told her he'd taken a job. He was teaching site safety orientation for the registry program. 4 sessions a week in 3 languages. He didn't speak with translators. "You know what I actually teach," he said. "It's not fall protection. 20 minutes of fall protection, then 40 minutes of how to document yourself." He taught men to photograph their own timesheets, to keep the envelope, not just the cash, to text a family member the site address every morning, to write down the name of the foreman who sent them up. "I tell them the same thing every session," Danny said. "The safety rig is what keeps you alive. The paper is what keeps you real." Ivy had to turn around and look out the window for a minute, because that had been the whole argument from the beginning in a sentence, and her brother had built it out of 14 months in a bed. Sal Ferraro was sentenced on a Thursday in April to 11 years. Ivy did not go. Dante did. They had talked about it for 3 nights beforehand, and in the end, she said she wasn't staying away out of fear or spite. She said she'd sat across from him in a library and heard him explain himself, and she didn't need to watch a man be taken out of a room to understand what he was. Dante went alone and came back at 9 at night and stood in the doorway of the study without taking his coat off. Ivy waited. "He said I killed the family," Dante said. "What did you say?" Nothing. He wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for a witness. He came in and sat down heavily. Then they took him through the side door, and he turned around and looked at me and said, "You'll understand in 20 years. "Will you?" "No." He rubbed his face. "But I'll wonder about it for 20 years, which is probably what he wanted." He was quiet a long while. Then he said the thing he had clearly been assembling in the car for an hour. "He wasn't wrong that I killed something. I did. I killed the part of us that needed people to disappear in order to work." He looked at her. "That was the engine, Ivy. That was the actual engine the whole time, not the guns, not the money. Just the ability to make somebody not count. Everything else was decoration." The other side of the Ferraro name did not end with a speech. Ivy learned that slowly over the 10 months, and it was the least romantic education of her life. It ended in liquidations and payouts, in 41 uncomfortable conversations with men in their 60s who had known Dante since he was a boy. Some of them took the buyout. Some of them left angry. 2 of them left for Philadelphia, and one of them in November sat in the study for 3 hours and cried. Ivy stayed out of every one of those rooms, but she noticed that his shoulders changed. The old L, the tight set, the mornings after got rarer through the spring, and by August she realized it had been a month since she'd seen it, and she didn't say anything because she was afraid of jinxing it, which was ridiculous, and which she did anyway. He told her once, only once, at 2 in the morning, "There's a version of me that would have solved all of this in about 9 hours in March. I think about him more than I'd like to. And you'd have hated him, and I'd have gotten to keep everything except you." He shrugged. It wasn't close. Vivian Castellane came to see her in September. The receptionist put it through as a Ms. Castellane, no appointment, and Ivy sat with her hand on the phone for 8 seconds before she said to send her up. She looked older, not broken. Vivian Castellane was not the kind of woman who broke, but stripped down to something smaller. Castellane Group had been reorganized out from under her. 2 of the 3 referred executives had taken pleas. Her license reinstatement hearing was in 14 months, and everyone in the industry expected her to get it because she was too good at building things for the state to waste. And everyone also knew that she would never again be the person whose name went on the front of a project. She sat down and did not make small talk. "I've asked myself the same question for 10 months, she said. "I've had lawyers and consultants in a very expensive crisis firm, and none of them could answer it, so I'm going to ask the source. How did a 22-year-old waitress take my company apart?" Ivy considered lying and being gracious. She reached into the drawer instead and put a spiral notebook on the desk. A new one, half full. Vivian looked at it. "That's it. That's it. That's all it ever was." "I had 41 lenders," Vivian said. "I had a compliance department of 19 people. You had 19 people whose job was to make sure the file looked right. Ivy leaned back. Nobody's job was to write down who was actually there. That's not an oversight, Miss Castellane. That's the design, and you know it is because you explained the design to me yourself in that office. And you were completely honest about it, and I've thought about that conversation every week since. Vivian's mouth tightened. So say the thing you've been wanting to say to me. You were wrong about one thing, Ivy said. Only one. Everything else you told me that day was true. The covenants, the syndicate, the 4 votes. I've read the bond package now. You weren't lying about any of it. Then what? You thought you had to erase them so the project would stand. Ivy put her hand flat on the notebook. The project collapsed because nobody counted the men on the platform. That lift was rated for 6. There were 9 on it, 9 Miss Castellane. There's no engineering mystery in that report, there never was. The load was the number of human beings nobody was allowed to write down. Vivian Castellane did not move for a long moment. Ivy watched her go back 14 months in her own head and arrive somewhere she had been refusing to go. I've read that report 11 times, Vivian said, and her voice had gone strange. I know, so have I. I never, she stopped. You never put those two things next to each other, Ivy said, not unkindly. Nobody did. That's exactly the problem. The invisibility wasn't a consequence of the accident. It was the cause. You can't calculate a load out of people you've decided not to count. Vivian stood up. At the door, she stopped and said without turning around, I built 3 cities. I know, Ivy said. That's what makes it worth saying to you instead of to someone who didn't. The registry hit 10,000 entries in October. There was no ceremony. Ivy hated ceremonies. But what there was instead was a Tuesday afternoon when a woman came into the office holding a printed page and asked in Spanish whether it was true. Her husband had been hurt on a site in Central Falls. Not badly a hand, but he'd been paid in cash for 2 years by a subcontractor who had insisted, as they always insist, that there was no paperwork. There was paperwork. He'd been entered on his first morning 11 months earlier by a foreman who'd complained about it the entire time. Name, photo, next of kin, the address in Tegucigalpa where the money went. His claim was approved in 9 days. Ivy sat with that woman for 40 minutes and did not say anything useful, and afterwards she went into the bathroom and put both hands on the sink and cried for about 90 seconds and then washed her face and went back to work. 9 days. Danny's had been denied in 17 bonds. The 2 of them were married a second time in November, and almost nobody knew. It was not a renewal, and it was not a ceremony. It was 11 minutes in a municipal office with a clerk who kept sneezing, and Marisol Duarte and Danny as witnesses, and afterward, the 4 of them ate at a diner on Broad Street, where the waitress recognized Ivy from the bar and got so flustered she comped the coffee. Ivy had asked for it. That was the part that mattered, and Dante had understood it instantly, which was why she'd asked. Because the first one had happened in 6 days under a threat in a room full of 300 people who had already decided she was a purchase walking 100 feet alone because there was no one left to walk it with her. This one had no debt in it, no protection, no counsel, no contract. There was nothing to solve. There was nothing being bought. Why this, Dante had asked her in a municipal office with a clerk. And Ivy had said, because the first time I said yes to keep my brother alive. I want there to be a record where I said it for no reason at all. He had gone quiet for a long moment. Then he said, write that down. That's a better vow than anything they'll hand us. She did. It's in a spiral notebook in a drawer in Providence. It came at her once more at the very end, and it came the way it always does, sideways on an ordinary evening from a person she wasn't afraid of. A reporter at a fundraiser she hadn't wanted to attend. Young, decent, not malicious. She asked Ivy how she responded to the criticism that her entire platform rested on marrying into money. Ivy heard the whole room adjust. 10 months ago, the question would have taken her legs out. She'd have gone hot in the face, produced 4 defensive sentences, and lain awake at 3 in the morning composing the 5th. She heard herself answer without any heat at all. It doesn't rest on it, it got started by it, and those are different things, and I think the difference is the only interesting part of this story. The reporter waited. I had the whole record when I was 19, Ivy said. 3 years of it in ballpoint. I had it during the 14 months when nobody would look at it. Marrying a Ferraro didn't give me the evidence. I already had the evidence. Everybody had it available to them. What it gave me was that when I walked into a room, people had to sit down and let me finish a sentence. She shrugged. So yes, I got in through a door that a lot of people don't get through. That's true, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But 9 men were on that platform, whether or not I ever met my husband, and the reason nobody knew is that the only person who wrote it down was a waitress. That's the story. The marriage is how it got heard. It isn't what happened. Somebody in the back started clapping, which was mortifying. Dante across the room did not clap. He was watching her with an expression she'd only ever seen on him twice, once at the end of an aisle in October, and once across a conference table at 4 in the morning when she told him the crime was one thing and not two. Later in the car, she said, "You didn't say anything. There wasn't anything left to say. You'd finished it. You've never once stepped in front of me. No, not one time. Not with Vivian, not with Sal, not tonight." "That's right." Ivy looked at him. "Why, he drove for a block before he answered. Because the first thing I ever did to you was hand you a contract while your apartment was still smoking," he said. "I've spent every day since making sure that was the last time anybody put you in a room where the only survivable answer was yes, or swarm." It rained the night it closed, which she liked because it had rained for the whole hearing, and she'd come to associate the sound with winning. She was standing at the window of the study with a cup of tea gone cold, thinking about nothing in particular, about the registry backlog, about whether Danny should be doing 4 sessions a week or 3. She heard him come in. She heard him cross the room and stop behind her the way he always stopped, 4 feet back, waiting, because in 14 months he had never once approached her from behind without giving her the second she needed. Ivy Calloway Ferraro closed her eyes. 23 years old, a father who signed her school forms without reading them, a landlord who came in without knocking, a doctor who explained her brother's spine to a case manager instead of to her, an insurance company that decided in 17 days that Danny had never existed, 2 men at a bar with a number, a drawer set on fire while she was at work, 9 notebooks in a burn barrel. Nobody had ever asked her anything. And this man, who could still empty a room in this city without raising his voice, had asked her every single time on a wedding night when he had every legal right not to, in a study at 4 in the morning, in a car outside a courthouse in front of a commission in a municipal office with a sneezing clerk. He had asked when it cost him nothing, and he had asked when it cost him his uncle, his company, and the name his father died, believing he was too clean to hold. She set the cup down. Then she turned around and closed the distance, herself 4 feet in her own time, on her own decision, and put her hand flat against his chest, against the open collar, against the ink at the base of his throat that she had been looking at on purpose since November of a year that had almost killed her. He didn't move. He never moved first. That was the whole man right there. Ivy looked up at him. "May I continue?" she said. Something broke open across Dante Ferraro's face. The last thing in him that had still been braced 10 months in 1 hearing, and 1 uncle, in 1 burned drawer braced. "Yes," he said, and she did, because $2 million had bought a debt, and 6 days had bought a marriage, and a burn barrel had bought Sal Ferraro 11 years. But nobody in the end had bought this. Nobody had negotiated it. Nobody had signed for it. 9 men went up on a lift rated for 6 because the state had decided they didn't count. And 1 22-year-old waitress with a ballpoint pen and a spiral notebook made a country write their names down. She was never rescued. She was believed, and she made them do it in writing.